of sexual abuse.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved, thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, "She's in the house, go and find her."
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, a tragic scene found by a dog walker.
He went into the woods to see what his dog was looking at, and sadly found this discovery of a young female lying lifeless in the woods.
The news no parent wants to hear.
I did not want to believe them. I was not prepared to believe them.
A killer who thought he could outsmart detectives, but who was given away by his own mobile phone.
If you're not allowing us access to it, you've got something to hide.
It has this wonderful little habit in the background, like all modern smartphones do, of backing up to the cloud, this nebulous collection of data.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
So I can remember quite vividly the morning that I got the call that a body had been found. I was actually at headquarters dealing with another incident and just handing it over and briefing another police force when I received a text message from the duty senior investigating officer saying, "Please ring urgent." So I gave them a call to be told that the body of a young female had been found here in the woods at the sports centre at Southampton.
In 2018, Detective Superintendent Paul Barton was the head of the Hampshire Constabulary's Major Crime Unit.
At 7:45 that morning, a local dog walker was walking through the sports centre and his dog had become distracted in the undergrowth just behind me. So he called his dog a few times, trying to get his attention, and the dog was just not having any of it. So he went into the woods to just explore to see what his dog was looking at, and sadly found this discovery of a young female lying lifeless. It is not a natural death. So I need to start thinking about what resources do I need to try and manage this investigation. Is it a homicide investigation or not? Well, experience would tell me that I think we would treat it as a homicide until we can prove otherwise. It was clear this was going to be a large investigation. It's a public place. It's a young female. Things like this just don't happen normally.
The scene was one of extreme brutality, despite the picturesque surrounding. A young girl lying face down with blood in the leaves around her.
That there was a bottle that was nearby to her. Now, was that her own bottle, or did the offender bring that in with them? Or perhaps it was there anyway, and that might be a potential witness that we could identify by some forensic examinations. She was fully clothed, so for me that would suggest that there was no sexual motivation in this. But I think what was most striking is there was no weapon And so the fact that we couldn't find a weapon, for me, suggested that, homicide was very likely, and that this young female had been killed and not taken her own life.
Within hours, news of the harrowing discovery in the woods had already started to spread.
We were told by a member of the public who rang into our offices that police had set up a cordon around an area of the Southampton Sports Centre, which is to the north of the city.
James Robinson was a reporter for the Southampton Echo at the time.
There was a fairly heavy police presence at the scene. Of course, whenever anything happens like this, you never necessarily assume the worst, and you never know what's happened. It could be anything from the find of drugs to something more serious like an assault of some type.
But detectives knew already that they were probably looking at a murder site. And that theory was confirmed when they moved the young girl's body, and the source of her wounds became apparent.
It was some sort of knife. It had been mainly used against the neck, which isn't very deep. There were occasional cuts elsewhere. There was a cut on a wrist, a cut on a forearm, something around the back of the shoulder, things like that, which were not very distinctive.
This is probably not just an argument that's got out of hand. This was likely to be a frenzied attack, and probably a planned attack as well. The fact that the female appeared to have been lured into the wooded area, which was secluded from the normal kind of pedestrian traffic that you would expect within the sports centre. And so quite quickly we came to the assessment that this was premeditated, and this was a planned attack against that individual. I think when the call came in, one of the first concerns I had was that, this happened in a very public place. This was the beginning of the school holidays. The weather was fantastic, and so people were going to be out and about. And at that particular time, we didn't have a named suspect. And so the fear that's running through my mind at that particular time is, who has done this? And more importantly, will they strike again?
In July 2018, a dog walker on the outskirts of Southampton had made a terrible discovery. The body of a young girl lying face down in a woodland. She had suffered multiple stab wounds and a level of brutality that left even hardened police officers shocked.
I think what was really troubling for me was, who could do this to a 13-year-old girl in such a public place. She suffered some horrific injuries, and she wouldn't have died from the first stab wound. She was attacked, in a frenzied attack, I would say, where she had multiple injuries, including defensive wounds. And so, it really troubles me to think what she was going through at that particular time, the fear that she would have faced.
But who was the young girl? Only the night before her body had been found, one local mum, Stacey White, had reported her daughter Lucy as missing.
On the morning that Lucy went missing, I saw her first thing in the morning. I was rushing to get to work, so I'd briefly said hello and good morning to her, and that I would see her when I got back. By lunchtime, I had a phone call from my partner saying that Lucy hadn't come back for lunch. That didn't concern me. It wasn't unusual. She had keys to my parents' house, so she would often go up there. If she was closer to their house than ours, she would just pop in there for lunch, or she would simply have lunch with a friend. She didn't have to be home until 8 o'clock. She'd said which friend she'd gone to. She was just out. It was the summer holiday. She was having fun. However, when 8 o'clock came and she still wasn't back, concerns started to creep in. She was renowned for being late. So we left it another 30 minutes just in case she was late. She still didn't come back. I then made phone calls, and different family members and friends and parents of Lucy's friends then started looking at the local parks. They started messaging each other to see if Lucy was with them. We put posts up on social media. When we then got to the last park, which was about 9:45 by this point, and she still wasn't home, I rang Hampshire Constabulary and reported her missing.
When DS Paul Barton and his team became aware of this missing persons report, it led to a terrible realization of who the victim in the woods might be.
At that particular time, our records showed that there was only one person that had been reported missing in the last 24 hours, and that was Lucy, who was 13, from the local area.
Lucy's mum, Stacey, was now dealing with every parent's worst nightmare.
The police had come to the house to speak to me. I naively thought that they were going to tell me that they'd found Lucy and that she was okay. They told me that they were 99% sure that it was Lucy at the sports centre. I just went into shock. I did not want to believe them. I was not prepared to believe them until I'd seen with my own eyes that they were telling me the truth. These were people that didn't know my daughter. How could they be correct?
As Lucy's family began to take in the news that she would never be coming back, Home Office pathologist Basil Perdue began his investigation into what had happened to her.
She had 11 stab wounds to the right side of her neck, 3 of which had gone through the biggest artery in the neck, the right common carotid artery, the big one supplying blood from the heart to the head. She had a number of other injuries, which were sharp injuries from cutting to her neck, lower face, and upper limbs.
Eventually, and after the pathologist's work was complete, Stacey was able to see her daughter's body one last time.
I could simply only whisper words to Lucy, words that I won't repeat. But one thing I will say is I promised her that I would get her justice and we would find who did this.
In order to find out who would have done this to a 13-year-old girl and why, detectives first had to understand everything they could about Lucy.
Lucy was a very cheerful, energetic young lady. She set her ambitions very high. She was an overachiever. She was very good academically. She was setting her sights to become a lawyer. She always had a lot of friends. She was full of smiles. She lit up a room when she went into it.
But there were things that detectives began to discover about Lucy, which even her family didn't know.
In any homicide investigation, one of the first lines of inquiry that I will ask to be carried out is what's called a victimology. And that's really going through the background and history of who you believe to be your victim to find out anything that we can that might help us identify who may have done this. And so part of the victimology would be to search the room of the victim and find out what information we can. And it's not unusual within a victimology to find out things that perhaps the family don't even know about. And with Lucy, one of the first things we found was her diary, which was extremely interesting and rang some alarm bells.
It was these diary entries of Lucy's which would give Paul and his team the first clues as to what might have happened to the 13-year-old and why.
So when we looked into Lucy's diary, there were a number of entries in there that had gone back over the last 12 months. And bear in mind, she was 13 years old at the time. 12 months prior to that, she would have been 12. And she was inferring that she'd been in a sexual relationship with an associate of the family who'd been staying at the family home that had recently moved out. and that she believed that she was in a relationship with this individual, and also she planned to have a future with this individual.
These private notes were equally shocking to Lucy's mum, Stacey.
The diary entries were chilling to read. I just felt sick. I physically wanted to throw up. My eyes were streaming. I was struggling to read them, but I needed to read them. And as much as I didn't want to read what was on them, I felt I had to read what was on them because I wanted to see what it was that they had found and what Lucy had said. She said I didn't know. I didn't know what was happening, and if I found out, I would have killed him. She said in these diary entries she had not told anybody. I believe that that is the truth, that she had not ever told anybody.
Initially, when I was told about the contents of the diary, and I keep an open mind and think, well, it could all be made up. But then when I started being told about some of the graphic detail that was within that diary, for me it was quite clear that actually this was reality. And so I was extremely concerned that not only had Lucy been murdered, but she was also the victim of sexual abuse over the last 12 months and maybe even longer. The person that Lucy had described that she was in love with was a male called Stephen Nicholson.
Who was Stephen Nicholson? He was someone, it transpired, who was known to Lucy's family as an acquaintance, and who had taken advantage of their trust and kindness.
When I first met that individual, it was under very different circumstances. He had needed to move out of the premises that he was in. He knew and had been friends with my partner as a child. Although they had been out of contact for several years, he had just turned up at our door after being at his sister's birthday party, intoxicated, and he just stumbled through, can I just stay the night at stupid o'clock at night? And he'd been directed to just sleep on the sofa rather than on the streets. This inevitably was a person who had no fixed address. He just sofa surfed. But he picked who he sofa surfed at very well, it would seem.
After that initial night, Nicholson often stayed at the family home, claiming to have nowhere else to go. Through Lucy's diary entries, police began to discover darker motives and a sad story of coercion and abuse.
Within the diary, there were things like Lucy had been practicing, her new signature as if she was going to get married to this individual. So it was extremely concerning. Quite clearly, he was grooming her. Once we knew of Stephen Nicholson's involvement with Lucy, he became a person of interest very, very quickly to the investigation. At that point, we were unsure as to why he would want to kill her, but we certainly had evidence that would suggest that he was in a sexual relationship with her, and the fact that this had been going on from the age of 12, it was statutory rape, and therefore he became a suspect, certainly for rape.
With a key suspect in their sights, the priority now for Paul and his team was to track down Nicholson. In 2018, police in Southampton investigating the killing of a 13-year-old girl had unearthed a terrible secret detailed in the child's diary. It revealed that Lucy had been abused for a year prior to her death by a man known to her family, Stephen Nicholson. Now detectives were on the hunt for a suspected paedophile and possibly a murderer. And the pressure to find that killer was mounting.
As a senior investigating officer for any murder investigation, I describe it as a privilege to be able to investigate somebody's murder and bring someone to justice for that person who sadly can't give evidence themselves and speak for themselves. But with that comes an awful lot of pressure on you as well to get it right and get that person. These types of crimes attract a lot of media attention.
But within hours, police had located their suspect, Stephen Nicholson, and he wasn't far away.
So officers were dispatched, and within 24 hours he was located at nearby Millbrook railway station by police officers and arrested without any further incident.
With Nicholson now in custody, Paul Barton's team began the task of interviewing him.
So when a person is brought into custody, they are offered free legal advice. It's not unsurprising that the advice they are given by their solicitor at that particular time is to go no comment. But much to my surprise, when Nicholson was interviewed, he started talking and began to give an account as to his movements that day.
Detective Chief Inspector David Story oversaw the first interview with Nicholson in custody.
He told us that on the morning that Lucy left the address, he had taken a day off sick and was working, doing some private work for an elderly gentleman whom he had been caring for a number of years. And it so happened that that individual lived very close to the scene where Lucy was found.
Nicholson said that he arrived at this old man's address at about 9 o'clock. He was sent off to the nearby Tesco Express to go and get him some cigarettes and some biscuits. And we actually clearly find him on CCTV at Tesco Express at 2 minutes past 9 that morning. He's got a bag for life in his hand. He goes back to the old man's address and effectively stays there till about 11 o'clock. And then he cycles home and he gives us the route that he takes on his bike.
Detectives now had an account of Nicholson's movements, but could CCTV reveal vital clues about Lucy's whereabouts on the day she died?
Lucy left her house at 9 o'clock on the Wednesday morning, and she'd asked for a watch from one of her brothers. Because she didn't have a mobile phone, she'd broken her mobile phone. We tried to track what Lucy had been doing that morning prior to her being found in Southampton Sports Centre. So we looked at various routes she could have taken and scoped for CCTV, and that subsequently showed Lucy marching from her home address up to the Sports Centre, and she was probably captured on CCTV about 10 occasions. The last sighting of her was just outside Tesco's near the Sports Centre. Lucy had left with her coat on and she was carrying a small sports isotonic bottle. What was quite significant about that was that you could just see on the CCTV that the bottle was mostly full throughout the journey. Despite it being hot, it remained full. And also she took her jacket off, which just was an indication of how hot it was. When Lucy was found, there was a bottle, the same as identified within the CCTV, which had the majority of the liquid still present, so she wouldn't have had much of an opportunity to have drunk that during the course of the day, which would suggest that she'd been murdered quite quickly after her last sighting.
Police turned to digital forensics to see if Nicholson's alibi rang true.
So Nicholson has a mobile phone, so we could check his mobile phone to see if that had moved. But actually Nicholson had offered that up himself in an interview, saying, you can check my phone, it shows that I was there, because he obviously knows that we can do tracking through cell site if his phone had been moving around. And sure enough, when we checked on the cell site, his phone showed that it had been static at this address for the time that he was saying. But I think what he forgets is that actually all that is telling me is that his phone is there, but he is not necessarily with that phone.
While his phone's location might have been static, a deep dive by digital forensic experts gave them an insight into Nicholson's behaviour.
So looking at Nicholson's call records, what was visible was a pattern of activity, particularly around text messages, where it was obvious that he was the sort of person who would reply to a text message very quickly after it arrived. But there was a period of time where that simply didn't happen over several hours. It was obvious that the phone wasn't moving because text messages were coming into it and they were all being received through the same mast. So it was probably just sitting in a single location, but no replies were being sent. And that didn't fit with the normal pattern of activity that Nicholson had exhibited up to that point. That allowed questions to be asked. Why hadn't he been replying the way he normally would?
Detectives realised that Nicholson's phone might hold the answers they needed.
When Nicholson was arrested, he did have a mobile phone with him, but we quickly established it wasn't the mobile phone he would have had in possession on the Wednesday. And he did tell us that he had disposed of his mobile phone because there was drug dealing activity on it, and he didn't want to be prosecuted for that. Clearly, we didn't believe him. We thought he'd disposed of the phone because it had something incriminating on it.
And so we said, well, okay, we haven't got your handset, but, we can still log into your data. If you just give us your password for your Facebook account, then we can have a look and see if there's any conversations between you and Lucy. And so he was asked for his password, and that was the first time that he then sort of showed some resistance in the interview and declined to give us his password.
As a detective, if someone's refusing you access to something, I naturally will think that's suspicious. I mean, clearly there are rights which I have to respect, but in relation to this, if you've been arrested for the murder of a 13-year-old girl and we're suggesting that there is Facebook contact between you and her on the morning that she disappears and is subsequently found murdered, I think that if you're not allowing us access to it, you've got something to hide.
When something like a missing persons inquiry or a murder inquiry, we would want to look at both the victim and the suspect's profiles if possible to find out, obviously, has there been contact between them? If there was contact, when was that contact? What type of contact was it? Is there an indication that they were planning to meet up for some reason? Do we know where they were going to meet? And if we find indications like that, we'll go beyond it. We'll start looking at other activity on the devices. So, for example, has one of them been researching particular routes to a meeting point or particular meeting points?
And when we established that Lucy had access to other media devices within the family home, we obviously seized those items and started to examine them. And what we established was that the conversation that we believe had taken place between Nicholson and Lucy had been deleted.
So we didn't have the mobile phone, but what was most important about Nicholson was his contact with Lucy the night before and on the morning of her murder.
With no evidence to charge Nicholson with Lucy's murder, police were rapidly running out of time before having to either charge or release him. To buy detectives more time, they now turned to legislation normally used to detain terrorists.
Under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act of 2000, or RIPA as it's known in the police, there's a piece in there that talks about when police are investigating a crime and they want to get access to somebody's password, then they can, under this legislation, effectively demand the password from the suspect. And if they don't give that password, then they technically commit the criminal offence. And it's normally used for things like counter-terrorism, but it's also used for paedophiles and indecent images of children. It's the first time that I've used this legislation in a murder investigation. I think probably the first time in Hampshire and possibly nationally it had been used in a murder investigation. Nicholson was then presented with the request to give his password, and he again refused. And so he was charged with that offence, and he was remanded in custody, went up to court the following morning, where effectively it's an absolute defence. You don't really have a defence to say why you hadn't given your password under those circumstances. And so he had no option but to plead guilty there and then in front of the magistrate. And he was given a 14-month prison sentence there and then.
The RIPA charge is a brilliant tactical holding charge to keep someone in custody so that they cannot interfere with any investigation that you're going to subsequently undertake. So he couldn't interfere with any witnesses, he couldn't dispose of any evidence. We had him in a secure environment and we could undergo our investigation.
With the benefit of this extra time, Paul's team began investigating Nicholson's movements through his mobile phone.
One of the problems in Nicholson's case was that there was nothing actually available from the phone directly. But being a relatively modern smartphone, it has this wonderful little habit in the background, like all modern smartphones do, of backing up to the cloud, this nebulous collection of data that exists on computers spread around the world.
So we didn't have the phone, but one of my team came up with the very bright and very innovative idea of cloning his phone. Because we had gained access to his Google account, we got a phone, we cloned it, same make, etc. And then when we turned it on, it downloaded all the data from his Google account. That data was gold dust to us because it then provided locations as to where Stephen Nicholson was.
Data relating particularly to a Fitbit was recovered. And Fitbit being an activity tracking device, there was all sorts of interesting information there about timings and movements.
He had told us that he had taken the same route he usually took when he had left the address at 11 o'clock on the Wednesday morning. So, being diligent police officers, we checked what he was saying, married up with what we now had from his phone. And we could see that on the journey back at about 1100 hours on the Wednesday morning, he took a slight detour. The majority of it was on the way back, but he took a 7-minute detour, which took him into an area called Tanner's Brook, a small secondary wooded area in between two estates. And that clearly was of interest to us as investigators.
Smart technology had highlighted discrepancies in Nicholson's journey. But detectives still needed hard evidence to prove his involvement in Lucy's murder.
Tanner's Brook is an area of natural beauty within the heart of Millbrook, surrounded by lush plants, a stream running all the way through. And for me, this area was really significant because what we also saw on our CCTV as we picked it up was that Nicholson was seen on his bike coming down in this area with his Tesco bag, which seemed quite full up at the time. And then when he re-emerges later on, we find that his bag is less full up, and therefore the inference being is that he's deposited something here in Tanner's Brook.
Could the vital forensic clues to link Nicholson to Lucy's murder lie here, hidden amongst the undergrowth? Southampton, 2018, and police are trying to solve the brutal murder of a 13-year-old girl. They've got a suspect in custody, but now they desperately need to find the forensic evidence that can link Stephen Nicholson to the crime. CCTV and digital forensics had placed him near an area of Tanner's Brook on the day of the murder. Now, Detective Superintendent Paul Barton authorised specialist police search teams who started combing the area for clues.
I pushed the button and said, right, let's go and search this area and let's see what we can find. And actually on day one, we struck lucky. The search team, within a few hours, found a Tesco bag for life that had some fire damage to it. And inside that was the jackpot as far as I was concerned. We found a number of items. The first one was some fire-damaged boxer shorts. What was left was literally the waistband of these boxer shorts and the label that was inside. And the label indicated that these were a pack of 3 Tesco boxer shorts. And that is interesting because when we searched Nicholson's home address, we found the other 2 pairs that would match that third pair. But not only that, inside the bag, we found some blue rubber gloves that had apparent blood on them. In addition to those items, we found a blue sweatshirt, hooded sweatshirt, which had again apparent blood on there and some fire damage. We didn't know whether that was Nicholson's or not, but obviously we were seizing that to send that off to the lab for some forensic examination. And we found some tracksuit bottoms, which were sort of black and white with an unusual pattern on the side. And again, whilst we couldn't say that was Nicholson's, by doing some research on Nicholson and looking at his social media account, we found an old photograph of him. He was wearing identical tracksuit bottoms to the ones that we'd found.
But could forensics prove, beyond doubt, that these items did indeed belong to Nicholson? And, crucially, also link them to Lucy?
The priority was to send those off for forensic examination, so that's what we did. And, within 24 hours, we were getting some very exciting phone calls from the scientists to say what they had found.
What the forensic scientists had found, finally, was DNA proof.
There was a blood stain that went through DNA profiling and yielded a DNA profile that matched Lucy. And there was also an additional 6 areas of blood staining that yielded mixed DNA profiles from more than one person, parts of which matched Lucy and parts matched Nicholson. And there was one area that was found to match Lucy's profile, that the statistics involved were 210 million times more likely that it was Lucy's profile than that of an unrelated female, and one part of a mixed profile that matched Nicholson that was 93 times more likely to match Nicholson than an unrelated male. There was a pair of blue surgical gloves found at Tanner's Brook, which yielded a full DNA profile matching Nicholson.
And then the jacket of Lucy's that Lucy was wearing at the time when she was found had also been examined, and that had blue fibres that then also came back to the Russell Athletic top that we found at Tanner's Brook.
Forensic analysis of blood, DNA and fibres now all link Nicholson to Lucy. It was a major breakthrough for investigators.
Now, I got those results when I was walking my dog, and when I got the phone call, my hands just went in the air as if I'd scored a goal at Wembley. I was so elated at what I was being told, because it had been so difficult beforehand that we didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden we'd cracked it. I knew at that point that Stephen Nicholson would be convicted of Lucy's murder.
Once we had all the forensic evidence back on Nicholson, we spoke to the Crown Prosecution Service and said, look, we think we've got sufficient evidence. And so he was produced from Winchester Prison, brought back into custody at Southampton Central, and then we had the interview teams go in there and interview him again. And so as part of our disclosure during the interview, we then hit him with the evidence that we had, which was, we've searched Tanner's Brook, we found these items have got your DNA on it, and these items have got Lucy's DNA on it. What have you got to say about it? And his face was just a picture, his jaw just dropped. And at that point, funny enough, he went no comment.
Finally, Paul and the homicide team had enough evidence for Stephen Nicholson to be tried for Lucy's murder. That trial started in June 2019.
On the first day of the trial, Nicholson seemed almost excited. He seemed to enjoy the fact that there was some kind of attention on him. Of course, we weren't here for him. We were here for Lucy. But Nicholson seemed to revel in the attention at first. But as the trial went on, his demeanour changed completely. But he remained arrogant and narcissistic right through the trial. He would swagger into the courtroom each day. It was like he didn't want to be there. He just couldn't care less.
What he was saying was that she was just a silly girl who had a schoolgirl crush on him, and he found her quite annoying, and yes, he was quite nasty towards her towards the end, because he just didn't like the attention he was getting from her and found that she was effectively a pain.
Lucy's mum, Stacey, went to the trial every day.
His attitude was still exactly the same. He still looked as though he felt he was going to get away with it. And whilst I only briefly looked at him, because I had no care to be looking at that person for any prolonged period of time, he even had the audacity to stand in court whilst giving evidence and thank me and my partner, for all the help that we'd given him. Which was just salt to the wound. He wasn't thankful, because if he had been thankful, he would have stayed away from my daughter. If he had been genuinely thankful, he would not have done what he did. He would not have been looking at a child in that way. He would not have continued over the span of years that he did to have done what he done.
After all the evidence was heard, the jury retired and they came back relatively shortly with a guilty verdict for murder. He was given a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 33 years.
Finally, justice for Lucy. But with Nicholson's conviction for murder came even more revelations about his past.
When we're investigating Nicholson, we go very much into his past and interviewed a lot of people whom he'd interacted with. What we did find, and he was subsequently charged with it as well, as we'd found out that he had met a 14-year-old girl a number of years earlier when he was 18, and he had actually had sex with her in almost the same location as Lucy had been murdered. That was particularly chilling from my point of view, that this area, this location, meant something to him. He'd actually had sex with a 14-year-old girl a number of years earlier, but then he'd also chosen to lure Lucy to the same location and murder her in that brutal fashion.
For me, what was particularly sad about this investigation is that, you know, Lucy was a 13-year-old girl, a typical teenager, and she had fallen in love with Nicholson, who I would say had groomed her from the very beginning for his own sexual gratification. But as far as she was concerned, she was in a relationship with him and potentially was going to marry him one day. You know, she was practicing her new signature with him, which I know children do, but, you know, this kind of shows that the affection that she had for him. But when he realised that actually, you know, I could be in trouble for this and I'm going to get found out, and so I need to end the relationship with her. And that's when he started being nasty towards her and effectively dismissing her and you know, breaking off the relationship with her. And she was obviously heartbroken by that, and she wanted to continue contacting him. And I think, you know, potentially sort of threatened him and said, you know, if you don't continue to see me, then I will tell my mum that, you know, we've been having a sexual relationship. At some stage, he obviously decided to respond to her messaging and said, yeah, okay, I'll meet you on that morning at 9:30 at the sports centre. And so I can only imagine that she was going to that sports centre and she actually genuinely thought that she was going to see Nicholson to patch things up and get things back on track again. But little did she know that she was effectively walking to her death.
Lucy was very streetwise, but it didn't help this situation. If people point fingers and say that they would know that something like this was happening to their own child, they're naive. Children are very canny at being secretive. Perpetrators are very savvy at telling your child what they want to hear, making them keep it a secret. And most of the time they will get to know the child enough to get enough information out of them to be able to then use something as a bargaining tool. If you tell anyone, I'm not going to do this anymore, or I'm not going to give you money, or I will hurt your family, and to some of the worst ones, I will kill you. He took Lucy. And none of us are going to get over that. You have to learn to live alongside her not being here while still wanting her here. You have to be, or at least appear happy and enthusiastic whilst her friends and other children of similar ages are graduating and they're having babies and they're in long-term relationships. And as lovely as that is, it is hard. It is really hard. Because that's what she should be doing. And she's not. And one person's decisions took all that away.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, she's in the house, go and find her.
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them if that's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode,
we uncovered and slightly disturbed 2 bones, which looked very, very much human.
A terrible discovery in a remote field where police had been led by a man whom no one suspected.
Talking to his neighbours beforehand, and they said, he's the wrong man. This isn't a killer.
But he had the blood of more than one victim on his hands.
He was asked, anything else you want to say? And he said, would you like another one?
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
We got to the scene about 8 o'clock from memory, and the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, had been given information by an offender or potential offender that a body had been buried in a particular place just inside a field in the plough soil.
Back in March 2011, forensic archaeologist Professor John Hunter had been called in by Wiltshire Police to search the corner of a field in this sleepy part of the Cotswolds.
Archaeologists are good at looking at changes to the landscape. They're good at identifying where things have been disturbed, where they might have been buried through vegetational change. You can use geophysics, you can use aerial photography, you can use all sorts of fancy techniques. At the end of the day, sometimes you just have to be manual, hands-on, and just remove topsoil to try and find where a buried body might be. Our work really was to try and find where the grave was, if there was a grave, and having found it, should we find it, then excavate it, follow the edges of the grave, recover the body, and recover with it all the evidence that may pertain to the person who put the body in the ground in the first place.
But locating a buried body in an area such as this is far from straightforward.
The information we got was quite limited, but that's not unusual. In our experience, when people say they've buried a body in a certain place, the chances are, because of landscape change and time and memory, it's usually not quite in that place. It's usually 10, 20, 30 metres away or in a completely different location. So if someone says there's a body here, then it may not be in that exact place.
Despite a full day of searching, frustratingly, Professor Hunter failed to locate the body.
We came back the second day, continued our small trenches by hand, using hand shovels, and then decided that it would be easier, more economical, to get a machine in. A machine with a wide bucket, about 3 foot wide, without teeth, and then just draw away the topsoil in a particular area. And the first thing we did was get this machine. We marked out an area, I think roughly about 12 by 8 metres, and systematically got the machine, and a very skilled driver, to strip off the soil at about 10 centimetres depth on each occasion.
Finally, the earth yielded the terrible discovery which John and his team had been searching for.
As the machine was skimming away carefully, it uncovered and slightly disturbed 2 bones, which looked very, very much human. And everything stopped immediately at that point. Everybody rushed in and stopped, and no one touched anything. We came in with our small hand trowels, cleared away where the bones had been disturbed. They'd actually been moved from what was eventually the grave. And then we cleared away the loose soil, recalling where it was, and then exposed more bones, clearly human, clearly in a fairly well undisturbed anatomy, and gradually, bit by bit, exposed what turned out to be a grave. It took us quite a while to excavate the body, and the first thing that was clear was that it was a very, very shallow burial. Maybe 20, 30 centimetres dug into hard rock, which would explain why it was shallow. Whoever buried the body there can't have known that it was going to be that hard to dig a body into the ground. The fact that it was close to the edge of the field, where there was deeper soil, plough soil, made it slightly easier, I suppose. But it was very obvious that the body was laid out on its back, but it wasn't all present.
The contents of the grave were as sad as they were terrible. Local TV reporter Rob Murphy visited the scene.
Only partial remains, awfully. Missing her skull, her hands and her feet.
Successfully finding the body was only the first part of the investigation. The next crucial stage was identifying the victim.
Many people might think that you've got the remains there, surely you could just get DNA from the bones. Actually, frankly, isn't that easy to get DNA from bones? You have to go through a whole process. But forensic analysis and scientists looked at it, and they were, fortunately from the investigators' point of view, they were able to get a match because the young woman was on the National DNA database, and her name was Becky Godden-Edwards. And she was on there because she committed a minor crime many, many years before. But because of that, she was on the database.
Becky Godden-Edwards had lived in Swindon until her disappearance in 2003, the last time she was seen alive. Now investigators needed to understand why she had been murdered. That quest started with the man who had led them to the field in the first place. His name was Christopher Halliwell, and he was already being held by police for the murder of another young local woman. In March 2011, Wiltshire Police had found the skeletal remains of a young woman called Becky Godden Edwards. She was buried in a field in Gloucestershire. She was last seen in 2003, getting into a taxi cab one night in the nearby town of Swindon. But Becky's disappearance was never solved at the time. Could the disappearance of another young woman in Swindon 8 years later help police solve what happened to Becky? At around 9:45 a.m. on the 19th of March 2011, police received a call from a worried young man. His girlfriend, Sian O'Callaghan, had failed to return home from a night out, even though she had texted him at 3:45 a.m. and was seen on CCTV leaving a nightclub at 2:52 a.m.
Ordinarily in these cases, the first thing to do is to speak to friends, family. Is there a reason why she hasn't come home? Obviously, there are a number of reasons why people don't come home, but quite quickly it was established that this was very unusual and she'd not done it before.
Detective Superintendent Sean Memory was part of Wiltshire Police's major investigation team when Sian disappeared.
She was in a stable relationship, she had a loving family, and there was no obvious reason why she wouldn't have got home that evening. And so within a matter of hours, a major investigation was launched.
People were worried. Actually, this was clearly something different. What we knew about Sian was often we get a steer from the police about missing people. You know, often these people have gone missing before, they may have chaotic lifestyles, they might have had something in their life recently which has been has caused them to want to disappear. But the intelligence that we got straight away, none of this was the case here. This was different.
The weekend passed with no trace or word from Sian. The only clue was from her mobile phone records, which sounded even more alarm bells.
What the police told us was Sian's mobile phone was no longer pinging off the masts here in central Swindon. It was pinging off a mast in Cadley, which is in Savernake Forest, which is 10 miles away. And that's utterly frightening because she has no reason to be there.
A huge search was launched in that area, with a massive turnout from the community to assist the police.
They had people out in horses. They had the police helicopter, heat-seeking helicopter, and some police were there looking. But news grew. And by that afternoon, there were coachloads of people who had been laid on from Swindon to there. There were church groups, there were friends groups, and by that evening there were many hundreds of people who had been bussed, who either just randomly turned up or had heard about Sian being missing. You know, this had touched this town.
And while huge efforts were underway searching through 4,500 acres of forest, back in Swindon, detectives were starting to comb through the town's CCTV records. Footage of Sian leaving the nightclub is found and analysed closely.
So as Sian came out of the nightclub, she walked along the street and you could just see in the distance a car slowly pulling up alongside her, but it was out of shot of all cameras. The next shot further up the road, Sian is no longer to be seen. So there's a fairly strong inference to be drawn that she got into that vehicle, which at that point was completely unknown.
The image was not clear enough to identify the vehicle in the distance, but there were other clues the police could work from.
So one of the first things the investigation did was send it off to an expert. Could you identify from the headlights what type of make, model of vehicle that was? From that, it was established that it could be a Toyota Avensis, which obviously narrows down the type of vehicle you're looking for. And quite unusually, as the vehicle went by, you could see like a shiny sticker or similar on one of the passenger doors. Again, not particularly visible because of the quality of the camera, but quite an identifying feature. The first thoughts for the team was this a taxi? It's unusual to have a sticker, sort of 2 foot by 3 foot stuck on the side of a car. But without a registration number, there were probably several hundred taxis not only working in Swindon that night, but travelling in from nearby towns.
To try and narrow down the search for the suspect vehicle further, police then called up the many hours of footage from patrol cars equipped with ANPR, automatic number plate recognition. That search led to a staggering find.
A passing patrol vehicle earlier on in the evening had passed a Toyota Avensis. No offences disclosed, but it had recorded the registration number of the vehicle, which revealed Christopher Halliwell as a registered keeper.
Who was Christopher Halliwell, and might he know where Sean was?
He was a regular complainer to the police when people either run away from his taxi or he witnessed assaults or was assaulted himself. So he was in our system, so it's a complete shock that a taxi driver who we all should trust should be the main suspect.
Further digital analysis linked Halliwell's car even more closely to the last sighting of Sean on CCTV.
The next thing to think about is Sean alive? If she's alive, do you want to notify Christopher Halliwell that he's a suspect? So do you stay covert, or do you go over and arrest him? The decision made that day was to stay covert and place him under surveillance.
In the days that follow, Halliwell is observed burning the taxi car seat covers and seemingly scouting out remote areas. Then later, he is monitored as he buys a large amount of paracetamol from a pharmacy.
So they take the decision to arrest when surveillance team watch him buy suicide levels of tablets on Thursday morning. That's when they strike and arrest him. We heard that a house in Ashbury Avenue, which is in a very nice suburb of Swindon, was being searched. It was clear that this was the man, he was the prime suspect, and neighbours frankly couldn't believe it. I was there doing a live report for the news that night and talking to his neighbours beforehand, and they said, he's the wrong man. Chris isn't a killer. My car breaks down, he'll fix it for me, he'd drop us to the airport, he takes my daughters to school. Yeah, a man of trust, and he was the man who was the prime suspect.
Time was passing, and so were the chances of finding Sean. So, 5 days after she went missing, and with Halliwell in the hands of detectives, they used special legislation to secure information about her whereabouts.
The provisions of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act allow for an urgent interview to take place. And that's allowed to take place if there's, for instance, someone outstanding, a victim that could be saved. So that interview took place in the car park without a solicitor, without access to his rights at the police station. And over a prolonged period, close to 4 hours, Christopher Halliwell made an admission that he had killed Sian O'Callaghan and agreed to take the officers to where he had lain her body overnight. For me, it was most unusual that a murderer is going to make any admissions. Normally they want to see what evidence you've got, they want to take legal advice. So I think the team were extremely shocked that he was prepared to take them to where Sian was laying. And I guess initially they weren't sure whether that was going to be true or not, but sure enough he took them to this deposition site in Uffington, stood looking down a bank and pointed to a spot where they could see the body of Sian O'Callaghan.
Immediately, detectives set up a crime scene around Sian's body and tried to keep Halliwell talking.
At this point, they return to the car. Halliwell is contrite. There's a convoy of police cars behind them. There's a police helicopter above. And Chris Halliwell turns and says,
"Would you like another one?" In the history of my career, this had never happened before. And do you want another one? What did that actually mean? So, of course, you're going to say, well, what have you got, Christopher? And he said, I killed someone in around 2003, took them to an area, stripped them, buried them in a field, and I'll take you there right now.
Halliwell then led the officers to the remote field in nearby Gloucestershire, where forensic archaeologists would unearth the remains of Becky Godden-Edwards. With Halliwell now having admitted to killing 2 women, it would be up to the police to secure a conviction. But that process was about to take a most alarming and worrying turn. In March 2011, a taxi driver in Swindon called Christopher Halliwell had admitted to the murders of 2 women, some 8 years apart, and he'd revealed the sites of where he had left both their bodies. One of them, Sian O'Callaghan, had been missing for a matter of days before the killer showed police where he'd left her. The other woman, Becky Godden-Edwards, had been reported missing 4 years earlier by her mother, Karen. Despite a turbulent and chaotic life in the years leading up to her disappearance, Becky's early childhood had been idyllic.
She was such an angelic little girl, and I always say sugar and spice and all things nice. That was Becky, and she really was a sweet little girl. She used to giggle a lot. She always loved nature. She loved animals. And of course, as she grew up, she loved reading. She loved school. She had lots of friends. She was always in the garden. She had a little vegetable patch. When she was 11, she started the big school. That was when her troubles began, because she was bullied. So I removed her from one school, put her into another school, but the bullying continued.
Becky started to self-harm and even attempted suicide.
She was then given a child psychologist to work with her because they wanted to get to the bottom of it. Oh, it was a terrible time. It was a really awful time. She then wanted to take her exams because obviously it was nearing her exams. She was almost 16. She then had to go into what they called an interim school. So while she was in this interim school, that was when she was introduced to heroin.
Becky's drug addiction spiralled out of control despite many attempts at rehab. Then her dependency took a dark turn.
I asked her, how do you get these drugs? How do you actually pay for these drugs? I have sex. I said, sex with who? You mean they pay you? She said, well, how else do you think I get it? I said, so you're selling your body for sex? I can't believe it.
Karen did everything she could for Becky. You know, this is a middle-aged mum living in a beautiful house in the outskirts of Swindon. She would go out and score drugs for her daughter, so her daughter wouldn't have to do it, you know.
So this is why every time I picked her up and brought her back home, that I would go out and I would buy drugs so that I could give her drugs and she didn't have to sell her body. It's a horrible thought. It's a horrible thought.
But despite Karen's selfless efforts to protect her daughter from sex work, Becky's dependency worsened. And after being involved in petty crime, then convicted of burglary, she decided not to come back to the family home, but to stay instead with a friend.
She said to me, Mum, I can't keep putting you through this. So I love you, Mum. I can't keep putting you through this. She kissed me on the cheek. And she said, I'll come back when I'm clean. And she just walked away, and I could see her just walking away. And that was the last time I ever seen my daughter alive. It was awful. It was awful.
Becky's family tried to track her down over the months and then years that followed. But despite reported sightings of Becky by various acquaintances of her family, she never returned.
Even though people had said they'd seen her, there was something inside of me just felt it wasn't right. So we went to the police station and asked whether they'd heard anything, because I thought they knew her. You know, she was known to the police, so they would know. They said, no, nothing's been flagged up.
And throughout the years that Becky didn't come home, Karen continued to buy Christmas and birthday presents for her daughter, hoping that one year she might turn up to receive them.
I didn't want her to feel that she'd been left out. And even my mum, we used to buy her Christmas presents and a birthday present. We'd write a card out, and it started accumulating. So we put them into bin bags and boxes, and we'd put them up in the loft. So when she turned up eventually, we could have given them to her, and she would know that we hadn't forgot about her, because, you know, her lifestyle was so chaotic. But she was still my daughter, and I still loved her.
And then, after 8 long years of missing her daughter, Karen saw with horror the news that the man who had murdered Sian O'Callaghan had also shown police to the grave of another woman he had killed, and Karen feared the worst. Those fears were confirmed with a visit from police.
There were 4 of them stood at the door, and I just said to him, "It's my daughter, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes, yes, can we come in?" And at that point, I remember just going absolutely hysterical. It was just like somebody just, it was just like a car crash. It was just awful. It was just awful. It's the news that nobody ever wants to hear. And I remember just screaming because I didn't want it to be Becky.
With the discovery of 2 victims, the entire community was stunned, and 2 families left utterly heartbroken. It was now down to pathologists and the use of forensics to piece together how these 2 young women had lost their lives. Becky's partial skeletal remains would not give up clues easily, but the recent deadly attack on Sian O'Callaghan would be easier to document.
So the post-mortem revealed that Sian had received a blunt blow to the back of the head, probably with a knife. There was also some indication that she'd been subjected to a sexual assault.
Halliwell was tried for the murder of Sian first. He pleaded guilty at Bristol Crown Court and was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years.
Abuse is hurled at this man as he's led from the court. He walks out, again under the blanket, into the back of the van screeches off, and the mob again are furious. They run down the street after him.
But there was no justice for the family of Becky Godden Edwards due to the way in which Christopher Halliwell, who now denied her murder, had shown police to her grave.
The only thing that led Halliwell to this body in a field was the confession he had given. And the confession hadn't been given properly in the eyes of the law. And so there was a big legal argument in private And the judge sided with Halliwell, that it wasn't admissible, that they could not show to a jury this confession. So effectively the Becky charge was dropped. They could proceed with Sian because they had DNA links with Halliwell on her body. Some of his saliva was found on her body, and there was some of Sian's blood found in his car. So he admitted Sian's murder in 2012, but the Becky charge was effectively dropped. To the horror of Karen Edwards, Becky's mum.
We were told that we weren't allowed to talk about it to anybody. The judge had put a gagging order on us, meaning that he was only going to stand trial for Sian's murder.
Sadly, there was no justice for the family of Becky. It had almost been forgotten.
And that is why, at that point, I thought, I've got to campaign now. I've got to get this case reopened.
It took 3 years, but Karen's determination paid off, and a new investigation was opened with a renewed hunt for forensic evidence to determine just who had killed Becky.
When I took over this investigation, I met with Karen Edwards and I made her a promise that I would do absolutely everything I could to bring justice for her and her family for the murder of their daughter.
In 2015, killer Christopher Halliwell had been in prison for over 2 years for the murder of Sian O'Callaghan. Now the investigation into the murder of Becky Godden Edwards had been reopened, and Detective Chief Inspector Sean Memory had been tasked with finding new evidence to convict Halliwell, the man who had previously told police where Becky's body was and who was now denying her murder. In order to be able to use Halliwell's previous conviction of murdering Sian in the trial for the murder of Becky, Sean needed to find similarities in the evidence of both murders and what the killer had done to the bodies.
So Christopher Halliwell is allocated a probation officer from Wiltshire as part of his prison rehabilitation, because even though he's sentenced to 25 years, he's still going to want to be released at some point and find some accommodation. So part of that process was he's seen by a Wiltshire probation officer. He was quite loose-lipped with her. He said a number of things to her about what had happened to Sian, which he'd not said to the police. And one of them was that he'd killed her in Ramsbury, stripped her clothes and placed the items in a pond. So we'd been in Ramsbury and we'd found lots of ponds, and we were driving back into Swindon for a meeting. We just drove along and happened to see this pond. It didn't appear on any maps, which was a bit strange. So we just stopped and we sort of tried to put ourselves in the shoes of Christopher Halliwell. Was this the sort of pond that he would have used? And as the three of us looked into the pond, right before our eyes, an object came to the surface, and we could see the heel of what looked to be a shoe or a boot. When we managed to hook the boot out and we quite clearly realised that that was the boot belonging to Sian, we then conducted a major search of this area. I think in investigations you do make your own luck, and whilst this wasn't a pond that we planned on searching, the fact that we were in here looking around at the right area, we had a bit of luck, and I wanted to be able to use the conviction of Christopher Halliwell for the murder of Sian as part of the evidence. It was much stronger to say to a jury that the man in front of you is already convicted of a murder.
Finding Sian's boot was a vital piece of evidence, one of many which helped prove that both she and Becky had been stripped of their clothing after they had been killed. Sean then turned to the items that were recovered from the killer's home, but there were over 3,000 of them.
In the shed where he lived, a spade was found, and my first thoughts were, could he have used it to dig the deposition site? Could there be some evidence on this spade? So we sent it away for analysis, and to be honest, I was hoping maybe Becky's blood would be on it or something similar. At this point, I met Lorna Dawson, a soil expert from Scotland.
We recovered soil from several spades, a pickaxe, a fork, and pieces of tape that had been adhering to one of the questioned spades. And from all those items, we were able to recover individual sources of aggregates less than a millimetre in size and analyse those individually. What soil science applied to the criminal justice system does is try to answer the where question. So, where could that unknown soil that is on an item have come from?
Using samples of soil taken from the field around Becky's unmarked grave, Lorna returned to the laboratory to see if those samples matched the material found on Halliwell's spade.
We look at them using a macro lens, describe the colour and texture, and then under the microscope we examine them further to look for any artefacts such as pieces of vegetation, hairs or fibres that might be retained within this soil. Then we take that same sample, hand grind it, and take a portion out and extract it for the organic profile. So that's the profile that's left behind by decomposing vegetation that has grown at that location. The other portion of the aggregate is prepared for the mineralogy of that sample, so that reflects the geology, so the rocks that are underneath that soil from where that soil has developed. So we get both aspects of the soil quantified, and then we can compare that with the known samples where we know they've come from, which are called the reference samples.
I was completely blown away when she phoned to say it was so unique in that field that it matched it as close as DNA to the soil on the back of the spade.
It was quite an unusual organic profile, so not just a common grass profile or a common woodland profile. This was quite an unusual signature that we got. At that moment, it really built our confidence that it's extremely likely that those soil aggregates had come from the location where the remains were found, rather than any other location. Because indeed, in that corner of the field, as it turned out, we heard after this that the farmer he'd not used this particular corner of the field. So unusual weeds and unusual vegetation had grown there. And that's why we got this really distinctive organic profile, nowhere else in the sample database.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed. This basically put that spade at the deposition site. I now needed to put that spade into the hands of Christopher Halliwell and also find some other evidence to support that he was there on that night.
With physical evidence made available through forensics, Detective Superintendent Sean Memory went on to seek more proof. That proof came when his investigations discovered two key incidents which had occurred in the days around Becky's disappearance back in 2003.
Through some research, we identified that on that very night that we thought Becky had gone missing, Christopher Halliwell broke down less than a mile away from the deposition site. He'd run out of petrol. Was that poor planning on his behalf? But it placed him very close to this rural location. Furthermore, we were able to identify that on the day, later on in the afternoon, he had an emergency appointment at his doctor's. He'd gone there on a non-arranged appointment. He had broken a finger or two on his hand, and he had scratches to his face. The doctor noted that he was highly emotional and didn't have an explanation as to how these injuries had occurred. But what was interesting was Christopher Halliwell had a long history of reporting assaults, criminal damages, what he witnesses as a taxi driver. He did not come forward on this occasion to say how his injuries had occurred.
Finally, Sean had the evidence he needed to bring about the trial which Becky's mum Karen had fought so tirelessly for. The Crown Prosecution Service agreed that Halliwell now could stand trial for the second murder of Becky Godden Edwards.
So I was really confident that we could get a conviction for this, but I went to see Karen Edwards and said, look, he's been charged. That doesn't mean to say he's been convicted.
But for Karen, and indeed all those involved, there were more surprises in store.
Well, we thought we were going in the courtroom, but we didn't. And we all sat outside. Next thing we knew, he'd sacked his barristers, and they'd come out and said, he's decided to represent himself. Who does he think he is?
The trial was pure drama. Halliwell defending himself, which is unheard of in a murder trial.
Christopher Halliwell, I've no doubt, conducted a load of research whilst in prison, accessing books, material about being a lawyer. I'm sure he thought that 30 years in the bar he could do overnight at Crown Court, which actually, again, played to our strengths because as well as he thought he did, he was appalling. He questioned everybody. If you were a witness, he called you. So he called me, and I didn't know what he was going to ask me, but it was a really trivial question. He'd said that he'd picked up some drug dealers, been asked to bury a bag, and he assumed that it was guns and not a body. And he basically asked me whether I thought that was true and was it plausible. For me, that was a really straightforward answer. No and no.
Halliwell claimed not to have known Becky at all, but what transpired through the evidence given was he did know Becky, and he knew her very well.
There was one of the witnesses who was friends with Becky, and she was called, and she was very brave. She stood in the witness box and she questioned him, he questioned her, and she said, "You know Becky?" And he said, "I didn't know her." He said, "But you did know her, you were obsessed with her. You used to sit and watch her all the time. You were absolutely obsessed."
They had had a relationship that he would offer to pay for her to not go out working as a sex worker. And the picture painted in court was he was infatuated with Becky.
But that was hard. Looking at him, stood there with that smug look on his face, knowing what he'd done to my daughter. I couldn't believe it. And now here he was, cross-examining other people, trying to wiggle off the hook, saying that the police had stitched him up, that they'd planted that soil on the spade. He was questioning Lorna Dawson, who is an expert in this field.
It was a very strange situation, but thankfully there was a very good judge who kept good control of the trial and indeed had to stop him on several occasions when he was breaching the law in the type of questions that he was asking.
It didn't take the jury long to find Christopher Halliwell guilty. I think it was 2 hours. We were surprised it was that long, actually. And he was given a whole life order. There aren't many whole life orders given in the country. I think at the time he was one of 50-odd killers in prison who will never see freedom again. But he's one of them. He's an insignificant man who did something deeply significant twice, at least twice.
The satisfaction for me is for Becky's family. They'd been denied justice. They'd been denied a proper burial. They'd been denied knowing for 8 years what happened to their daughter.
That's what this should all be about, really, about young Becky, whose mum adored her, whose brother loved her, and was just, a free spirit, and was adored and loved back, and was a big personality by all accounts. And this should be about her, not the man who took her life.
Finally, Becky's family got the outcome they had fought so long and hard for. It had taken 5 years, 2 investigations, and importantly the use of forensic evidence to secure the conviction of the man who had murdered their beloved daughter. But it was a bittersweet moment for them.
Yeah, it was hard. We all went down to the pub and we all raised a glass. And we'd put on the Justice for Becky page. We're all going to raise a glass tonight for Becky. And it was lovely because all the photographs were coming through with people raising a glass. It was just amazing. And we done it. I'll never get my little girl back. But we got justice. We got justice.
If you have been affected by any of the issues raised in this programme, help is available online at sky.com/viewer support.
Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
The finding of his DNA wasn't just on the murder weapon, it was on a most important part of the murder weapon.
This evidence was the breakthrough that we needed.
The forensic evidence in this case was crucial.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science brought the most dangerous killers to justice.
A truly horrific criminal, a monster.
It's a hammer blow. You don't know how you're going to carry on.
We'll hear how some of the most disturbing crimes were solved, thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
He basically said to me, "She's in the house, go and find her."
The amount of blood that was there indicated that there was a frenzied attack.
There was no reasonable explanation for them. That's why he changed his plea.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
The key thing about having a DNA profile is you've got probably the sharpest tool in the box.
I was so elated beforehand. We didn't have the evidence, and all of a sudden, we'd cracked it.
In this episode, in an ordinary town, the most extraordinary of murders.
Stabbed her 9 times in the back and twice in the neck. If she'd have known that she was going to lose her life, she'd have fought.
A woman killed in her own home and a family torn apart.
And then my husband spoke to the detective who said the word deceased. Then I knew Mum had gone.
And a search for a killer that took years and revealed a history of attacks.
I suppose I could have been his next victim.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer.
1994, I lived in Regent Street in Wakefield. This felt like a very safe area to live. I mean, I would walk down the street at night on my own. I would walk down to the pub. I would walk home from the pub by myself. Most people knew each other, so you could guarantee walking home that you would see somebody that you knew, or somebody would help you walk you to your door, or, you know, it was a very safe neighbourhood to live in. It was the kind of place that you would leave your doors unlocked.
It's the 15th of March, 1994. 24-year-old Melanie Jane had been living in the Bellevue area, around a mile southeast of the city and close to the main cemetery. She was off work, recuperating from an operation, when a man knocked at the door asking for directions.
The man was about 5'9", 5'10", balding on top, very short hair around the sides, dark eyes, really dark eyes, I'll never forget that. He had really dark piercing eyes, and he was wearing a bomber jacket that was zipped right up, jeans and trainers. I got a bad feeling about him as soon as I opened the door. It was his eyes. His eyes were really, really dark.
He had a piece of paper in his hands and claimed to be looking for an address further down the street.
While I was talking to him, I kind of looked down and his feet were like shuffling a bit close to the threshold. So again, this alarm bell was ringing even louder now, and as he was talking to me, he tipped up this piece of paper accidentally, and there was nothing written on it. It was a blank piece of paper, and that was when I knew. I thought, this guy's not right, and I literally slammed the door on him before he could get a foot over the threshold. I locked it.
It was a decision that potentially saved Melanie's life.
I've got goosebumps just thinking that I'm actually back here, that where things could have been so different. It makes me feel quite sick, to be honest. I suppose I could have been his next victim.
Detective Superintendent Bob Taylor was a senior officer on West Yorkshire Police's major investigation team in 1994.
I was at home in Leeds when I received a phone call from the control room. They said there'd been a murder and I couldn't go. So they sent a traffic car over to pick me up and took me to Barn Lane in Wakefield. It's just out on the edge of the city centre.
By the time Bob arrived at the address in Barn Lane, a main road heading west out of the city, police had secured the crime scene and identified the victim.
They told me that the victim was Wendy Speaks. She was a 51-year-old lady, and she'd been found in the upstairs bedroom. Her boss had been ringing her because she didn't turn in for work, which was very unusual, and they couldn't get an answer. So they rang Wendy's daughter, Tracy.
I had a phone call from the lady that my mum worked for, and she said to me, Tracy, do you know if your mum's not well? Because it's not like her not to come into work. I just literally froze at my desk and my blood ran cold, and I just knew there was something wrong from that moment.
With the alarm raised, Wendy's concerned colleagues had gone to the house, where they had found her body upstairs. The police came at once.
So apparently the local police had to come to me rather than me being told over the phone what had happened. So I had to wait for that. But in the end, I just kept ringing the house, and then my husband spoke to the detective who said the word deceased. And I've never seen my husband cry, and he cried when I knew Mum had gone.
An initial assessment of the crime scene suggested that Wendy hadn't been home long when she was attacked on the 15th of March.
Everything indicated that Wendy had never got into her normal routine when she arrived home.
She'd always go in the back way into the conservatory, and then she'd lock the door, and she'd walk into the kitchen from the conservatory, and she'd take her shoes off there, take her coat off and her bag, because her shoes and everything were in the dining kitchen area. And then she'd pop the kettle on and make herself a cup of tea. She'd take her jewellery off to get comfortable, so she'd put her watch on the windowsill, and she'd put her slippers on, and that'd be her in for the night then.
So whatever had happened shortly after she came home. We calculated that she would probably have got home somewhere around about 5:20 to 6 in that previous evening.
In that short time frame, Wendy had been raped and brutally stabbed to death.
When I first got to the doorway of the room, I could see through the open door that Wendy, she was only a few feet away from where I was standing, and she was she had one arm across the bed and she was slumped down, and there was blood staining on the cover. There was no signs of a fighting. There was an outline as well in blood of the knife on the bedspread. So there's no signs of struggle. So she was very compliant, and as if she'd have known that she was going to lose her life, she'd have fought.
While forensic investigators examined the crime scene, police under the command of Detective Chief Superintendent Paul Johnston conducted door-to-door inquiries looking for witnesses. And they found one, a worker at a printing firm opposite Wendy's home.
So this is the window that the employee was standing at when he saw Wendy open a front door to a man and have some sort of conversation with him. Wendy seemed quite relaxed. She had her arm folded. The witness noticed that she had her carpet slippers on. And then the person she was talking to went down the side of the house with Wendy still at the front door, so with her arms folded, looking around the house to see where he was going, what he was doing. But then the employee had to leave this room only for a few minutes. And then when he came back, he saw the same person coming out of that door, Wendy's house. Came down a couple of steps onto the footpath outside the house, glanced to his right, and then set off walking initially to his left, up the hill towards Wakefield city centre. And after a few paces, he started jogging up the hill. And from that, the witness was able to give pretty good description of the man and also what he was wearing.
Police now had an idea of what Wendy's potential murderer looked like. But they would need forensic evidence from the scene and an entire dedicated team to help catch the killer. In March 1994, police in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, were investigating the murder of a 51-year-old woman in her own home. Wendy Speakes had been raped and then stabbed to death. It was a level of violent crime rarely seen in the town.
In Wakefield at that time, the crime was a lot of shoplifting, but serious crime wasn't very high, although it had a reputation of being a young person's drinking spot. So, assaults, a lot of sort of alcohol-related assaults and injuries were probably higher than the norm.
People's lives in the community definitely changed. I certainly think in that area of Wakefield, people were worried about the possibility of it happening again. Was there a serial killer on the loose?
Because it created a lot of upset, particularly for women living on their own, husbands going to work and the wives being at home on their own, and all we could really do was to reassure them, increase uniform patrols in the areas and give them the advice, do not open your door to somebody you do not know.
The loves of Wendy's life were her 2 daughters. One of them, Tracy, at the time lived away from the community in Fear in the south of England.
My mum was one of these ladies that was 1 in a million. She was loved and liked by everyone. She was very loving and she was like my best friend really and my confidant, and I could talk to her about anything. So really, really close, and she loved her girls. She always wanted 2 daughters and that's what she had, and she was forever grateful for that.
But Wendy's life was ruthlessly cut short and her home had become a crime scene.
I set things in motion with the pathologist and the forensic science to come. I didn't go in the room because I didn't want to disturb anything.
And within that room, the killer had left some remarkable and very visible clues.
I saw in the room that on the bed there was a pair of stockings. Strangely enough, the foot of one was torn off and they were twisted together. They had loops in them, which seemed strange. And the stockings packet was still there on the bed. There was also a piece of pink candlewick rag that was laid on the bed, which didn't immediately fit in with what we were seeing. On the left, there was a set of drawers. And on those drawers, there was a pair of ladies' black coat shoes.
This man had brought with him a murder kit and a pair of mules were part of it. He took them and made Mum wear them. They asked us if they were Mum's shoes and categorically 100% they were not her shoes. She would never have bought plastic, cheap, horrible mules that were not anything she would wear at all, and we've never seen them. They were not her shoes and he brought them with him. A pair of Mum's black high heel court shoes, Italian ones that she'd only bought recently, were missing from the shoe cupboard, so he took those with him as a murder trophy.
With only one possible eyewitness sighting of a man on the street who might have been the killer, forensic investigators knew they would have to rely on the crime scene itself. And their first clues came from bloodstains in Wendy's bedroom.
Could she have been injured anywhere else, or is there any other sort of movement of blood? Because of the nature of the attack, was there any chance that the offender might have cut himself? Because in something where you are, you're doing this, there's a chance that your hand could slip down the handle and you could cut yourself. When we got back to the lab and started examining the clothing, because a lot of the items were heavily blood-stained, we found that we'd got some blood that wasn't Wendy's on some of her items of clothing, as well as, I think there was some on the bedding.
Police now had the killer's blood, but forensic teams continued their painstaking search to find more vital evidence that would help identify Wendy's attacker.
It's often referred to as the golden hour by detectives, but that's the period of time where the maximum evidence that can be extracted from a scene is going to be available. It's actually rarely an hour, sometimes it's weeks, can even be months. And nevertheless, it's called the golden hour because that's the period of time when you have to seize every opportunity you can get to get what evidence is going to be. And you don't know what that is until you've got it, and sometimes you don't know its value until far later into the investigation.
Paul Johnson said, right, you're in charge of the scene. I want you to rip that house apart. There's got to be a print. Take the banister rail off. In fact, they took the door off. I said, it doesn't matter what damage you do, we'll pay for it.
The only way that could be done properly will be to take the door handles off and subjecting them to specialist fingerprint examination. It's called supergluing at the time. But there could have potentially have been other fingerprints on the UPVC doors as well. So we had to take the doors off. We had to cut the doors in half to get them to be able to fit into the machines to do the analysis. I remember we knew that the murderer had gone up the stairs. There's always a chance that the murderer would have left a fingerprint on the wallpaper going up the stairs. I remember taking strip by strip that wallpaper off and having each strip examined individually for fingerprints. And I remember also the feeling of guilt almost at doing that, at further defiling Wendy's memory and her home when someone had been into that home and done such a terrible thing, and there we are making the destruction even worse somehow for the family. Feeling terribly guilty about doing that. But it had to be done.
It was hard initially walking into Mum's home because it was no longer her home. We'd spent all those times together sitting in the conservatory, and it was just a murder site, and people in forensics outfits walking around Mum's home, and it was just surreal. And you could see how, if it wasn't managed properly, that forensics could be lost by people walking, touching, or accidentally, rubbing their jacket against something and wiping off a fingerprint. So the way that they managed the crime scene, I'm forever grateful to them.
And the damage was worth it, as the forensic team's meticulous searching of Wendy's home did yield some clues.
So we found blood on the wall just inside that front door. We found blood and a partial fingerprint on the door handle. And of course, significantly, it's on the inside. So whoever put that there had to have been in the property. Unfortunately, the fingerprint was only a partial print.
That was the strongest clue. Unfortunately, they ran the match multiple times through the system. It was clear that whoever this thumbprint belonged to couldn't have had a criminal record.
With no fingerprint match likely, the forensic focus now turned to the blood found at the scene.
DNA profiling was in its infancy still in those days. We knew we had a DNA profile from some of the body fluid staining at the scene that could potentially provide some very compelling evidence in the future. However, in 1994, the DNA database had not been born. We didn't have the technology to do a DNA database. So we were very much working with our blood groups and doing a blood grouping screen, and I was very much involved in that. So we had hundreds of blood samples in to do this blood grouping screen, and we also had hundreds, if not thousands, of blood samples in to do a DNA screen. So we had a two-pronged attack, and the police were phenomenally busy having to go out and get samples, because back in 1994, it needed to be blood samples, which then needed there to be a police surgeon to take those samples. So it was a very, very big effort.
We took DNA samples from well over 5,000 men, voluntarily. Now, sort of hindsight bias would have it when people look at murder investigations that happened some time ago. It's very easy to think, well, this was sort of done and dusted straight away. They had the fingerprint on the front door. It was obvious that was the murderer's fingerprint. Well, it wasn't. It was obvious that the murderer would have a background of serious sexual offending. He didn't.
Alongside the time-consuming blood testing, detectives tried a more unusual method to narrow down their search for the killer.
As a proactive side to the investigation, I decided what we'd do is try and draw people with a shoe fetish out. So we put a piece in the Sport newspaper with a telephone number which we'd set up, and we had a flat set up in Huddersfield for people who wanted to talk to this woman about shoe fetish. You know, I wanted to meet her. So people would set up in the incident room. So people would ring this Huddersfield number, we'd come through to the incident room, and she'd talk to them. She'd ask them if she wanted to meet, and then when they turned up at a flat in Huddersfield, they'd be met by a couple of detectives who'd, take a mouth swab and a DNA. But yeah, so we had hundreds of people ringing up this number.
But frustratingly, the man who killed Wendy wasn't one of them. He remained at large, and although the case was never closed, it did go cold.
I think one of the things I found really hard with the investigation was that I expected that they'd find this man because so much forensic evidence was at the scene. So it was really hard to accept that it was going to take time because he wasn't on the system. And I had to be patient, which isn't one of my fortes, and I just wanted answers.
Tracy's wait for answers would last 6 years, when police would finally make a breakthrough in the case. In 1994, police had been unable to find the killer of a 51-year-old woman from Wakefield, West Yorkshire, despite having recovered a partial fingerprint and a DNA profile from the murder scene. None of the evidence found had matched that of any offender already on record. Wendy Speakes had been raped and stabbed to death, and 6 years later, in the year 2000, her family was still hoping that one day detectives would find the man who had done this to their mum.
I think not knowing at the time it was going to take so long to find him was more of a challenge, really. It's very, very frustrating because you just want the answers and then you can try and grieve.
But the science of DNA profiling was evolving rapidly in the mid to late 1990s, and both West Yorkshire police and forensic scientists didn't give up trying to find Wendy's killer.
As soon as new technology came on board, this case had the full treatment. So every time there was a new breakthrough in DNA technology, it was being upgraded, and it was all about whether or not the individual was going to be on the DNA database and whether or not that profile was then going to be searched.
Despite thousands of samples having been taken, there was still no match to either the partial fingerprint or the DNA profile found at the scene of Wendy's murder. But just as DNA science was advancing, fingerprint analysis was also becoming more accurate, with identification made possible using even just partial prints. And in March 2000, there was a match. The prints belonged to a man called Christopher Farrow. He was living with a partner and child in a Leeds suburb, less than 30 kilometres away from Wendy's home in Wakefield.
He was 33. He lived in the Cookridge area. He was just your average Mr. Joe Public. Worked as a painter and decorator, had a 9-to-5 job.
He'd been in a pub, and there was a policewoman in the pub and he was bragging about drinking and driving, so she actually arranged for him to be arrested. So they took his fingerprints.
I remember vividly, once we got the name of the person who had left that fingerprint, immediately looking at the background and being absolutely astonished that his profile didn't anywhere near fit that we expected it to, if he had been the murderer. No criminal convictions to speak of, no history of sexual offending, no connection, as far as we knew, to Wakefield. So why would his fingerprint have been there? And you immediately start thinking, well, is this a red herring? Could this be the murderer? Or could it be someone who's had legitimate access to Wendy's house? But clearly we were going to be speaking to this individual. The very strong likelihood was that he was going to be arrested, and we were going to be seeking his DNA.
Paul decided to proceed with that arrest, and what his officers discovered when they moved to make it would surprise them all.
I sent a team of our best detectives to his house to make the arrest. They commented straight away that he was a real cool individual, hardly showed any emotion or even reaction at all. It's very strange, isn't it, for someone who's been arrested, pulled out of the bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, arrested on suspicion of murder, to not even ask, why me? Why have you come into my house? But he didn't do any of that. He kept very, very quiet. So straight away you're getting a good feeling about this individual. But we still wanted that definitive proof. And then it was straight over to Wakefield, where he was interviewed.
In custody, Farrow continued to play it cool and deny any involvement in Wendy's murder.
No, I don't know Wendy Speaks, never been to Wakefield. All right, well, we'll take took a blood sample, one to go to forensic for blood grouping, and the other one was going down by motorcyclists to the Metropolitan Police Lab, because they were the only people at that time that could do a DNA in 24 hours. They tell him about the fingerprint. Tell him about the fingerprint was found on the inside of the door handle. No, never been to Wakefield, don't know Wendy Speaks. Then we get a phone call from the forensics scientist to say the blood grouping from the blood sample we sent to them is the same as the semen. Now, blood grouping is you can get a rare blood group, which can be 6.2% of the population, so, it's not definitive. But it was the same blood grouping. And that's when he rolled over and confessed to killing Wendy.
When he admitted it, it was mixed emotions, to be honest with you. I remember watching him whilst he was being interviewed remotely and thinking, even then, could this really be Wendy Speaks' murderer? Someone who has got no history as such. Not someone I was imagining would end up interviewing about Wendy's murder as a true suspect. But then when the DNA evidence was put to him and the fingerprint evidence, he admitted it.
And still, detectives tried to get answers to some of the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle.
We want to find the whole truth when we interview suspects, but they don't necessarily will give you it all. When it was put to him that, you had a knife, you had this rag to use as a gag, you bought these stockings, you had you had a bit of a murderous kit here. Oh, no. The rag was in my pocket because I used it at work. I used it to clean your hands. And the knife was just something that, happened to be in there. It certainly wasn't one of Wendy's knives, so he brought the knife to the scene. He told us where he disposed of the items, but cost us 6 years on. But he was insistent that he didn't have a shoe fetish, and that he only killed Wendy as an afterthought. But now, 9 times, stabbed her 9 times in the back and twice in the neck. I don't think so. He never left that room. He never got up to leave. He knew that she'd have to die, and he'd come prepared for that.
Eventually he said some terrible things about, well, I was having a bad time, someone was going to get it, stuff like that. I don't believe a bit of that, to be honest with you. He's never given an explanation as to why he did what he did. He's never explained his fascination with shoes, shoe fetish.
But one answer which detectives could finally provide for Wendy's daughters was who had killed their mother 6 long years before.
I just remember Bob saying to me, we've got him, Trace, we've got him. And I just fell to the floor for a minute and cried that all of the 6 years of emotion and not knowing, and it all just came out. And he told me about the fingerprint, the name, and did I know anyone named, or did Mum know anyone named Christopher Farrow? And I said, absolutely not. Is there any reason why his fingerprint would be on your mum's front door? Absolutely not.
And Wendy's family weren't the only ones who were shocked by the news that police now finally had someone in custody for her murder. Word had reached the local community too.
The day I found out he'd been caught, my sister rang me on my mobile and she was like, have you seen the Yorkshire Evening Post? Well, across from my flat was a paper shop, so I dived in there, got the paper, I didn't look at it, I just bought it, went home, got into my flat, opened it, and his face was on the front page, and I was just like, wow, that's him. And then I was literally physically sick. I had to run to the kitchen sink and throw up, because I think that was the defining moment that told me how lucky I had been that day.
In the year 2000, after 6 years at large, the killer of Mother, Wendy Speakes, had been snared by a partial fingerprint he'd left at the crime scene. The man was from a Leeds suburb, not far from Wakefield, where his victim had lived.
When Christopher Farrow appeared before the Crown Court, we turned up on the morning only to be told that he would be entering a guilty plea to murder and several other offences. And yet the courtroom was absolutely packed at Leeds Crown Court.
Wendy's daughters attended every day of the hearings. The man who finally sat in front of them during that time, and who had admitted killing their mother, was not the kind of person they expected.
I was thinking and expecting all those 6 years it'd be this big, horrible murderer, and he wasn't. He was just this pathetic little, balding, skinny little man. And I was shocked that was the last person my mum saw. And I went to every hearing and he wouldn't look up. Cowards, that's what he is. He's a coward. He didn't want to look at me and my sister. He didn't want to look at my family. He had his head down. And that's what he wants. He wants it all to go away. Minimise, minimise, minimise. And that's been his strategy all along.
Christopher Farrow was the most ordinary of ordinary people. I doubt any woman would fear sitting next to him on a bus, a train. There was nothing remarkable about him, which is, what we often say. It's what's behind the eyes that, you don't see.
And Wendy wasn't the only woman this seemingly ordinary man had had his sights on. Another witness came forward, known in the trial as Woman A. She too had met Christopher Farrow on her doorstep just 1 hour before he killed Wendy. He had tried to persuade her to let him in, but sensing something was wrong and having seen him loitering on her street that morning, she slammed the door in his face. Given that he had raped and murdered Wendy not long after, Farrow was charged with attempted burglary and intent to rape Woman A, and later went on to admit his guilt.
How he chose Wendy is one of those questions that's very difficult to answer, because Wendy and Woman A, age difference, 25, 30 years apart. So what it was that attracted him to the person, apart from that if he'd followed them previously and he knew where they lived, and, is then into his fantasy realms, buying the stockings with therefore Woman A to wear, or was that part of the fantasy murder that he was creating, where he clearly had put loops in the stockings and possibly at some stage might have had them round Wendy's wrists? I don't know. So that's really one that, only he could answer. But when we got to court, he denied anything in regards to Woman A. While we were swearing a jury in, because we needed to, we were going to go with it, he came back and said he'd admit to the approach to Woman A as well. So, in agreement with the Crown Prosecution Service, said, right, we'll accept those pleas. Now, of course, what we didn't do, because he denied it all the way up to court, we'd never had an opportunity when he had admitted it to sit him down and say, well, how did you choose that? How did you choose that?
He was keen to minimise what he'd done. I think it's all part of the fact that he's never really, throughout all of these years, never showed any remorse. And I think he tried to explain what he'd done away as he described himself as a rapist who murdered and not a murderer who raped.
And he got sentenced. His counsel tried to suggest in mitigation that he only killed her because she could identify him, and the judge really tore him a strip off, saying, that's not mitigation. No, it's not. You killed her, and you intended to kill her, whether you did it before or as an afterthought, you still killed her.
On the 14th of November 2000, Christopher Farrow was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 18 years for the murder and rape of Wendy Speakes.
The fact that he's admitted guilt but never shown remorse ever, it just shows what kind of a psychopath he is. And that's the way he is. He feels no emotion, he feels no remorse, he doesn't have any. He saw Mum as an object. He sees women as an object. That's the way he is. That's his DNA.
Ultimately, it was forensic science that solved the murder of Wendy Speakes. And the dedication of the detectives who were working for me and for others, and also the dedication of the fingerprint officers. But we were all working on what was found at the scene of Wendy Speakes' house. DNA technology undoubtedly was the key.
He didn't just single my door out, he knew where I lived. I personally think he was watching me, definitely. And I don't think I was the only one either.
But for Wendy's daughter, Tracy, the fight to keep Farrow in prison continues. Since 2018, he has been refused parole twice. That decision is reviewed every 2 years.
And that's why every parole hearing I fight for Mum, and I fight to keep him in prison, and I'll continue to do so. Because that's where he belongs, and that's the justice, and having that justice helps us get on with our lives, knowing he's where he should be. I'll not even contemplate how I would live my life knowing he'd been released.
But it is the treasured memories of her mother that form a bond with the past, which will never be broken for Tracy.
One of the fondest memories of my mum was when she gave me away at my wedding. And she had this beautiful blue outfit on and pearls, and I remember her saying, "Oh, I wonder if everybody will think I look like the Queen Mum because I'm wearing my pearls." And she put together this fantastic speech. She stood up. She was so nervous she couldn't eat, and then she stood up to do her speech, and it was fabulous. She was fantastic.
These moments you will treasure because they mean the most. So let us raise our glasses, and while I propose a toast to the bride and groom.
Her walking me down the aisle and her doing that speech and being there at my side for my wedding is probably the fondest memory I've got of my mum.
Yo, listen up, there's a tale of dreams and strife. In the hustle and bustle, we carve our life. From the concrete jungle to the starry skies. We chase our passions, reaching for highs. Born in the city where the lights shine bright. Every day's a battle, but we fight the good fight. We grind and hustle, no time for rest. In this urban jungle, we give our best. It's the rhythm of the streets, souls in the city of dreams, where the story unfolds. We rise and fall, but we stand tall in the concrete jungle. We give our all. From the block parties to the late night scenes, we live for the moments, chasing our dreams. Street poets with words that ignite. In the pulse of this city, we find our light. From the underground clubs to the rooftops high, we dance to the rhythm, reaching for the sky. In the hustle and flow, we find our way in this concrete. Yo, I'm stepping up, ready to ignite. In the game of life, gotta keep the fight. From the city blocks to stars above, chasing dreams, spreading love. Born in the hustle, raised in the grind. Every challenge we face, we leave behind. With every beat, we find a way. In the urban jungle, we make our play. Give our best. It's the rhythm of the streets, the pulse of our souls. In the concrete jungle, where our story unfolds. We rise and fall, but we stand tall in the heart of the city. We give our all. From the neon lights to the darkest alleys, we navigate through the chaos, never dilly-dally. Street smart, we hustle hard in the city's rhythm, we play our part. From the underground scene to the mainstream.